Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Welcome to the Visibility Project podcast.
Started by a group of citizens in a small Michigan town with a like-minded goal
of increasing the visibility
of the unseen and unheard populations in our community.
Our guests will share stories and insights
with the goal of increasing our awareness and knowledge
of various aspects of diversity and equity
to create a more connected, empathetic, and inclusive community.
So, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
So let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Welcome back to the Visibility Project podcast for our second full episode. I'm your host, Jeremiah Lee. Spearheaded by members of the Cultural Awareness Coalition, the project is the brainchild of several organizations and individuals with shared values who sit on the project steering team. We hope that the podcast series creates a deeper empathy for others and serves as a catalyst for people to actively create a more inclusive community and world. In our inaugural episode, we discussed the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-racism, and the history of systemic racism. Our guests were two individuals with a wealth of knowledge and experience, as they are both African Americans from an older generation that lived through the civil rights era. This month, we will be continuing the conversation, but we'll be hearing the voices of two younger African American individuals who are active in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It will be interesting to hear how their views compare and contrast to last month's guest. Among other topics, we will be discussing the passion of the younger generation, the impact of media outlets and social media, the topic of microaggressions, and the difficulty of finding mentors in the workforce for people of color. Our guests today are Mr. Javonie Ellington and Mr. Jamaal Washburn. Javonie is from Detroit, Michigan. He is a double major at Northwood University in Midland, Michigan, where he is specializing in hospitality management and accounting. He is also very active on campus. He is the entertainment chair of the 46th Annual Stafford Dinner, the co-president of the Black Student Union, the co-events director of the International Student Organization, and a member and ally in the Sexuality Advocacy for Everyone, SAFE Club. Javonie looks forward to a day when the world doesn't reflect in favor of one race. He believes innovation stems from diversity and inclusion. Jamaal was born and raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. In 2017, he obtained his Bachelor of Science in Accounting from North Carolina A&T State University. After graduation, he moved to Midland, Michigan to begin working at Dow's finance departments. He recently switched career paths and now does commercial sales for Dow's industrial solutions business. Having the insights from Javonie as a university student and from Jamaal as a young working professional will add even more perspective to the continued conversation on their fight for social justice. Welcome back to the second episode of the Visibility Project podcast. Today we have Javonie Ellington and Jamaal Washburn. So welcome, Javonie and Jamaal.
Thank you for having me, Jeremiah. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jeremiah. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for being here, Jamaal. So I'm going to ask both of you guys a question just to get to know you both a little bit more before we get started in some in-depth conversations. But I want you guys both, I guess I'll start with you, Javonie. Can you tell us what it was like for you growing up? What were some of your struggles? Maybe who were some people who supported you growing up? If you can just let us know a little bit more about yourself.
So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up around a really diverse group of students, group of people, and my parents gave me the utmost support. Some struggles that I did have was I was a very sheltered child. So I didn't really know about much of what was going on in the world. And it took me moving to Canton, Michigan, that reflect people that don't necessarily look like me to learn about the other side of the spectrum, basically.
And do you think your struggles kind of like increased at that time when you made that move, or?
It was definitely a changing experience. I had to learn that there's an entire different group of people that don't think like me or look like me at all. And sometimes I really had to change the way I thought. And sometimes those people aren't willing to do the same thing.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, Javonie. How about you, Jamaal? What was life like for you growing up? What were some of the struggles you had, and who supported you growing up?
So I was born and raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it's actually the capital of North Carolina. So I was used to being around a lot of different people who looked like me, who didn't look like me, different ages, different backgrounds, outside of the state, or who grew up outside of North Carolina, or people who were, lived there all their lives. So I was there from when I was born till 23, when I moved up to Midland. And growing up, it was just me and my mom. So I was raised in a single parent household. My dad was around. I knew he was. He just didn't live in the house with us. My parents got divorced probably around 6th or 7th grade. And ever since that moment, my mom was the one who really spent most of the time raising me. Only child, so I got a lot of one-on-one time. I wouldn't say I was sheltered, but at the same time, my mom made sure that I, kept my idle time. She really watched over that really well, as far as keeping me involved in the extracurricular activities, different camps during the summer, whether it was school, getting me involved in different clubs and organizations. So that was really who raised me, was my mother. And I think one other important thing to throw in there was that I do have an older mom, so my mother is 66. So the reason I bring that up is she was raised in the Jim Crow South. So a lot of my upbringing, nothing really surprised me, not only living in the South, but just from my mom's perspective. She went through integration of public schools. She remembers drinking from colored-only water fountains. So she really kind of embedded that other side of America, so to speak, into me at an early age, just from her lived experience.
Well, thanks for that. I'm sure that has, helped to shape the way you view the world as well. Having it's only one generation away that segregation was a real thing. And in today's conversation, I want us to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and why this moment feels different than other movements in the past. And to me personally, I think this moment does feel different. And I guess I'll ask both of you this question: Why do you think that this moment in time feels different from earlier struggles for equality?
For me personally, I say it's all on COVID. Jeremiah, if I'm honest, I think that's the only, in my perspective, that's the only thing that makes this time and any other time in history different. And when I reference COVID, I mean that in the perspective that nobody has anything. Well, let me take that back. Most people don't have work in an environment that is constantly in their face anymore. So, I mean, all of our working conditions have changed since the country's went on, so to speak, lockdown in March. And I think this is the most time in American history. This is the biggest time in American history where most of our citizens, just quite frankly, aren't focused on work in the same way that they would be if it was any time outside of COVID. People are working home. They have their kids in their houses, watching a lot, consuming a lot more entertainment, whether it's television, news, etc. We're just taking it, and we have the opportunity and the bandwidth to take in so much more information than we previously could have, because we would have just been occupied with life. It would have just been a regularly scheduled program, and we would have been going to work physically in the office, commuting, taking the kids to school, the whole gamut of life. But right now that life is on such a standstill, so to speak, everybody has a lot more time to learn, to witness, to hear perspectives than we previously ever had before. So I think that's what makes, this moment in time different than ever before.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamaal. On top of that?
Honestly, Jamaal, I've never even thought about that perspective, and I'm floored with that response. It was literally a perfect interpretation of how things are correlating, honestly. Like Jamaal said, people do have more time on their hands, and now everything is sort of like a save face. I feel like a bunch of companies, a bunch of organizations jumped on the Black Lives Matter organization or the movement because everyone else did it. So it's a bandwagon effect. No one really, I don't want to say no one really cares, but it doesn't really feel genuine. And it's like, no, I've never endured living during blatant segregation, but it's like nothing really changed. I've been an advocate for Black Lives Matter since the beginning. I do this every single year. We fight for police brutality. We say everyone's names. We peaceful protest, but nothing really happens, unfortunately. America thrives off of propaganda, and it's hard for some reason, the American people have trouble noticing or trying to figure out what is propaganda versus what is actually real. They're choosing not to see it. And that is the biggest slap in the face, honestly. I feel like we're in a movement where people just say they're with you, and then they do whatever they're going to do, whatever their true colors are to do behind your back regardless.
Yeah. And, Jeremiah, I'd like to piggyback off of Javonie's comments. One point that he brought up as far as the bandwagon effect. I thought about that too, and I really had to sit back and really, observe the landscape of, corporations and large institutions and their stance on the movement. And what I've been noticing is it's the fear of missing out, or the fear of being left out, is the probably better way of saying it. Is if I don't make a statement, I'll be the outcast, or I'll be the one that didn't say something, so therefore I'll be seen as, or can be, construed as racist, or somebody who is, disconnected or doesn't, have any true interest in the topic. So I think a lot of what Javonie is noticing, and I'm noticing in some, corporations, and what I've been, just witnessing, is just the statements are so generic and so it just feels so much like a template that I can see through it. It feels, and it doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel genuine. It's almost like it's like somebody pretending to be somebody they aren't, in a sense. It's like you can almost see it sometimes. So with this bandwagon effect, it's just a lot of companies, a lot of corporations, they don't want to be seen as the one who, didn't take a stance or didn't, put that in there on their website. So let's do it. That way we can keep our customer base happy, or we don't disrupt anything in the normal course of operation. So I agree with that, Javonie. I do have a sense that a lot of these large companies are just kind of joining the wave or joining the bandwagon.
FOMO, fear of missing out, is definitely a new thing, and kind of a buzzword now, but it seems applicable here as well. So in our last episode of the podcast, we had a very similar type of conversation, but our guests were from an older generation. So the reason we have done another back-to-back here on similar topics is I'm guessing that your opinions may be slightly different, maybe they're the same, but how do you both think that your generation is taking on this challenge now? And more importantly, do you think it differs from the generation of our previous guests? So I guess comparing the older generation and your generation in this struggle. So I'll open this up to either of you. How do you think it differs from generation to generation?
I guess I'll start with this one.
Sure.
Kind of going back to my lived experience with my mother. One thing, as we look at the news and different outlets, and we see these stories and these events happening and tragedies happening across the U.S., we just have living room talk, just family talk, and I'll go back and forth with my mom and say, "Hey, Mom, you went to school, pre-integration. So, how does that compare? What is this as bad? Did you have as many cases? Did you witness as much death? As far as around you, or intimidation by white Americans. And she's like, Jamaal, this is something, it's the same thing, just a new variation is the shorthand answer that she gave me. It's like, it's the same exact things we were dealing with in the Jim Crow South. It's the same things we were dealing with pre-integration. It's the same thing. I mean, going all the way back to even before my mother's time. I mean, going through some of my grandmother's experiences that she shared with me, it's just, it shows its head in racism and the systematic injustices. They just reappear in different formats throughout the course of history. So one thing I will say about the older generation is I feel they're more patient. And what I mean by that is they are more willing to play the long game when it comes to having justice served. So, I mean, my mom waited. She remembers the Voting Act, the Voting Rights Act. She remembers, like I said, integration in the public schools. She remembers all these movements throughout history. But the reason I bring those up is it took time. It didn't just happen after somebody got shot and then, legislation was changed. I mean, this is stuff that we were fighting for, that my grandmother was fighting for, my great-grandmother was fighting for, that my mom was just able to realize in her lifetime. So overall, I know it's a long answer, but I would say the older generation is more patient with justice being served. And then also they're, what I've heard is more, reluctant to change and to challenging the status quo. And to put a little bit more color on that is we had a conversation about the upcoming presidential election. And I'm talking about when the Democratic primary was 10, 12 different candidates. And I remember from the very early when it was that many candidates, she said, Jamaal, I'm voting for Biden. I don't care. I don't listen to any of these newer politicians. I know him. I grew up with him in Congress and, with him in Washington. So, that's the side I want to be on. I know what I'm getting. So I want to stay with that. And I mean, it was even tough having her listen to any of the interviews or debates or perspectives from other candidates because she saw who she knew and who she felt like she could trust, and that's it. And I feel like the younger generation is the opposite. We take all the information in, we base it off of recent facts, recent patterns and behaviors, and really make our decision based off of that. So patience and reluctancy to change and hear other opinions is something I feel like separates the younger generation from older generation. So I'd be curious to what you think about that, Javonie.
Yeah, Javonie, can you have anything else on top of that?
Reluctant to change is definitely a strong point. Definitely is really high on the list. I feel like because of social media nowadays, every information is so available, like it's so on point. My generation looks to Twitter and Facebook and things like that as their source of news. We don't watch the actual news because we know how it skews the mindset. That's what our parents watch. And they're so invested in what's going on, what's going to be actually posted on the news, and therefore they end up missing out on a lot of things that are happening, but just aren't newsworthy. This sort of like piggybacks off of why it was such a difficult thing to get people to acknowledge police brutality. I know on Twitter I see police brutality all the time. I see it every day, actually. And when I talk to my friends about it, they don't necessarily see it because Twitter is propaganda as well. They market things to the specific individual, and I see it all the time. So it helped me stay on top of the current events, like the current police brutality cases, events that basically aren't being filtered. And I feel like that's what you get from the news. Our generation is definitely more adamant and ready to fight for something without necessarily knowing everything. Like my generation is crazy. They're they're ready to put all of what they are into one thing. And it's very inspiring, and it's very great sometimes, but a lot of times we think based on our initial aggression or our initial reaction rather than thinking things through sometimes. And it sometimes hinders us because if we would have thought it through, we probably could have approached it differently. But
that makes me
definitely.
think, Javonie, when we were having our conversation about this podcast, Javonie is my student, so we work together on a lot of things. And I was like, so what'd you think of the podcast? And I remember you saying, like, I don't know if I can be so calm and collected like they were. I'm passionate.
Oh, yeah. I'm a very passionate person.
And that's part of the reason I wanted you to be one of our guests on here too. So just a different perspective for sure.
About the news portion, that is huge. That is one thing that I can't believe I almost forgot it. Was the where we get our news from. And it's nothing wrong with where we. Okay, let me take that back. Sometimes it can be things wrong with where we get our news from, but historically and from my lived experience, the older generation sticks to two news outlets. The older American generation sticks to two news outlets: CNN and Fox. Now, we're not going to go into the political affiliations that are associated with each of those networks, but if the news doesn't come through on one of those networks, then it almost didn't happen in the eyes of the older generation. Or if it doesn't come through those networks during the daytime programming, it's seen to them as propaganda, like Javonie mentioned, or it's fake news or whatever you want to call it. It's just not real. It's not accurate. It's not a fact. If it did not come through on CNN or Fox, the older generation just automatically, in my experience, just discredits whatever the information is, and that's something that I noticed that is definitely the difference between us. We not only at Twitter. I mean, I look at I try to stay off Facebook because that has its own things too. But the point is, it can be anywhere from online. It doesn't have to be one source. It could be the Washington Post. It could be New York Times. It could be BBC. It can be a lot of different forms. I feel like the younger generation is way more acceptable of different media outlets than the traditional ones that we are used to or brought up on during traditional cable programming.
So Jamaal, I'm going to ask this question of you, since you're a little bit older than Javonie, and you're already in the workforce. So a lot of research shows that people of color and people in marginalized groups have more difficulty trying to find professional mentors in their field who can understand their struggles. So Jamaal, have you had any difficulties in this regard?
Yes, great question, Jeremiah. I'm as you were asking it, I was nodding my head and trying to come up with examples, but not even just as. I'll take that question as a professional and as a student, because I remember the difficulties of finding a mentor on both sides of the fence. But I'll start with the professional side. Coming into a large corporation, specifically Fortune 50, Fortune 100, or Fortune 500, whatever, by default, you come into an organization that doesn't look like you. So off the bat, you have different lived experiences just off from that fact right there. The demographic in corporate America is skewed towards white Americans. So minorities automatically come in and representation matters. So what we see is a lot of times what we believe we can either achieve or be. So to come in and find a mentor in any company, but specifically a large company, is tough. Just think about it like this. I almost equate it to finding a therapist. Think about finding a mentor like finding a therapist. Not everybody is going to understand you. Not everybody is going to have the same background as you. But the ultimate goal of therapy is to find somebody that you feel comfortable in talking to and that you have enough in common with to learn from and to gain wisdom from and to leverage within your own personal life. So with the same thing with therapy as in corporate America, it's just not enough people that make us feel comfortable with their backgrounds. So even if I come into a company And a lot of times, they'll try and match you up with a mentor. Like, you were an accountant, or you did this degree, or you went to this school, or you have this in common. So we'll just match you. But a lot of the times most of the times that doesn't work. It just doesn't work like that. So it's extremely difficult finding a mentor in the professional work setting. And Javonie, I'd be interested in hearing what it's like and some of your difficulties finding a mentor that understands you on campus. I'd like to open it up to you as well.
Yeah, and Javonie, maybe you want to mention what field you're studying for as well.
Thank you. So I am studying hospitality and accounting, and on the hospitality spectrum, it is extremely hard to find anyone that actually looks like me, have some of the same values as me, that understand why I want to be in hospitality so badly. It is very hard. Even the alumni, none of them remotely even look like me or think anything like me. When I sit in class, I am sort of looked at as a problematic person because I bring up points that nobody likes to talk about. They much rather just avoid it than talk about it at all. And the average person would be discouraged by that. And I look at it as a challenge because I'm like, I want hospitality to do better. And if nobody wants to do it, maybe it's my calling. Unfortunately, somebody has to do it. It's definitely hard to find someone that shares values that you do and understands where you're coming from. I know that when I talk about finding mentors, I have a mentor. Jeremiah is actually my mentor. He doesn't look like me at all, but he understands. He tries to learn and be a better person each and every day. And that's what I want somebody to do, because I know that predominantly corporate America won't look like me and they won't share the same values as me.
Well, I appreciate it, Javonie. And I always say I like working in higher ed because I learn just as much from my students as I teach. So I learn a lot from you and all my other students. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, I want to hop back in on that one because I think I want to answer that one a little bit better as well too. As far as like mentors in the workplace setting now, I do want to level set. I do have Black mentors and sponsors, as well as white sponsors and mentors as well too in the workplace. But the numbers are it's such a huge gap. So I might have maybe 5 to 10% mentors that don't look like me, but the other 90 to 95% definitely look like me. And I don't think that's even a workplace or educational, higher education problem. It's really just a world problem. I think it all ties back into what we're seeing today and what's going on with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. It's so hard for minorities to find mentors and sponsors to, go to bat for them. It's because we just don't have people who understand this traditionally. Our background, some of the way we think, a lot of the times the way we were raised and in the environments in which we were raised. So it starts with the person and how willing is that person to learn, to listen, to understand, to hear lived experiences. And for the most part, in my experiences, I've had more people that look like me that are willing to take the time out to do that than those who don't look like me, who are willing to take the time out and do that. And that's why I think the numbers are so drastically different between my Black mentors and my white mentors. It's just like within America now, I feel like, and not to generalize anybody, but I just feel like my Black peers or mentors or professionals or colleagues are just, they understand that they have that lived Black experience. So when they see somebody that is trailblazing or coming up behind them, they're so much more apt and willing to lend that reaching hand. Not saying that white counterparts aren't, but they just don't have that beginning level of understanding and empathy to even begin to relate a lot of the times is what I'll see. In either situation, I feel like I've learned just as much from my Black mentors as I have my white mentors. It's just really from that beginning of the heart perspective is I just generally go out and see way more Black colleagues that are willing to help me than white colleagues are.
Thank you both for that. And to give you a little background on what prompted that question for me is actually another podcast I listened to. And it was an African-American surgeon who was talking about how difficult it was to find mentors in the medical field, and him going into working with patients, and the patients being like, okay, who's my surgeon going to be? And he's like, well, I'm your surgeon. And they're like, really? And he said, well, they're answering this because I was a person of color and his mind. And so, and this really is kind of quintessential microaggression. So I guess that leads me to the question is, Javonie, I'm going to ask you this because I know we've had conversations about this. Can you define what a microaggression is for us and what they are? On top, and after that, we're going to ask you both, can you talk about if you've ever experienced microaggressions and the effect that they have on you? So, Javonie, I'm going to pass this off to you.
All right. A microaggression is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as racial or ethnic substances. And I experience a bunch of microaggressions because I don't typically look like people disregard that being Black can come in all colors, and you can look different and still be Black. So I've always got lumped into the mixed group where they make you pick a side. And that's not necessarily what I like to do. I have people always ask me if they can touch my hair as if like I'm a pet or anything. And I don't understand why you need to pet my hair. I've had people ask me if I had both my parents involved in my life growing up, and I'm like, why does that matter? Does it really deter the kind of person I am? I've had people start talking about people of color with me in joking manner, not knowing that I'm a Black man, and is very eye-opening because it's like a lot of people are trying to deter it, steer away from it now because it's so prevalent nowadays, where people still slip up. And unfortunately, you're going to really have to continue to hammer it into people that, you have to think before you speak, or you have to be willing to learn.
Yeah, I've experienced microaggressions, but that was a great breakdown, Javonie. It's interesting, even within that, the way you answered that question, how some of the microaggressions that you've gotten that I haven't gotten. So just to give a little background, since this is a podcast, I'm not as fair-skinned as Javonie, so I'm more mahogany or chocolate, I guess, if you would, use those adjectives. So I do have a darker skin tone. So I've never been in a room or a situation where I've had a race talk about me as if I wasn't Black. So that was just interesting to even hear from your perspective. It clearly it's more obvious for me that I'm of African descent. But I've gotten some interesting microaggressions as well. I'm talking about in the workplace, like in a company as large as Dow as well too. So it doesn't just, happen in certain companies or certain places. This happens to this day in America. So one of the things I'll never forget this experience. I was on the flight for work, and we have the company has some of our own planes. So like if we're going in between certain office locations, we don't have to fly commercial. So we have our own aircraft that we own and operate. And as an employee, you can use those to get to different meetings and different, locations for work. So I was going to Philadelphia one day for a work meeting, and I got off the plane. And on the plane, the attire is business casual minimum. So, just you can wear some jeans and a button up and some nice shoes or something like that. But you can't wear sweatpants, pajamas, or anything like that. So it's kind of like a dress code up there. So I'm dressed as usual, business casual, going to my work engagement. And as soon as I get off the plane, I had a white colleague who rode in the plane with me. Like, she rode in the aircraft with me. We get out off the plane. We get off and start to grab our bags, right? And she asked me, just me. She looked and turned towards me because I was the only black passenger in the kind of parking lot waiting area for the baggage. And she came up to me and asked me, "Are you going to bring out my bags, or what do I do? What do I do next? Like, how do I get my bags?" And I'm sitting dressed in business casual. I don't look like a baggage handler. I have on my Dow badge, and she still asked me this question. So it was pretty mind blowing. And experiences like that happen more than you like to believe. I don't like to call this a microaggression. I think it was just an aggression. I'll never forget it. 2 weeks after George Floyd, right? The whole George Floyd tragedy. I sat on a WebEx meeting, so the equivalent of a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams video meeting. I sat on a WebEx meeting for 4 hours, and one of the people who had their video on in the WebEx meeting had a Confederate flag in their background, hanging, framed, in a picture frame on the wall behind them, in the view of their camera, literally beside their head for 4 hours. So I don't like to think of that as a microaggression, like I said, but more of an aggression. So those are just a couple of instances where even in the workplace, within the last 2 years, so from 2018 to that last incident I just shared with you was this summer in June, 2 weeks after George Floyd. These aggressions, they still happen, and it's eye-opening, it's shocking, and it also tests your patience, because I also did the same thing, and I looked up the definition of microaggression, because it was one of those words where I knew what it meant, but I didn't really know the book definition. But Javonie read it already. But my definition of it before I went and looked up the exact definition was it's a question that you wouldn't ask your friends. So going back to the hair question, I always the can I touch your hair question I've only seen that towards minorities, or specifically African Americans. I've never been in the workplace, and just think about it for everybody. Just think about the last time you've seen a white American in an office setting asked to touch their other white peers' hair in that way. I've never seen it, and maybe Javonie, you can speak up and tell me if you've ever seen it. But that's how I see a microaggression: something that you wouldn't do to your friend or your colleague. That any question. Do you have both of your parents? Are you adopted? Are you, I've even had a situation, unfortunately. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a friend. We were in the same event. He had somebody come up to him. He was African American. He wasn't fair skinned, so you could tell he was of African descent. And he was having a conversation with one of our colleagues, and he was like, well, what do you like to do in the area? It's a lot of stuff to do around here. And my colleague, gave him his answer. I can't remember the specifics. But then the white colleague, after he provided his answer, he then proceeded to ask him, one thing I forgot to mention is that, in the city, it's a great place to find drugs. Because I know you're into that sort of thing. And I mean, verbatim, said it that way. And again, this is within the last 3 years. These people are on a corporate payroll. I mean, this isn't just like some random street person. This is somebody that works within our organization. So, like I said, the microaggressions, I tend to really believe they aren't micro a lot of the times, but that would be some of my experiences and how I would define it.
Yeah, and they're often subtle. Like microaggressions are often subtle, and often the person saying those utterances aren't being consciously racist in their minds, and it doesn't necessarily always have to relate to race. I mean, Javonie and I've had conversations about how it relates to more international students. They'll come up and say, "Well, your English is so great. Where are you from?" And I'll be, "Well, I'm from New York." No, really, where are you really from?
Yeah.
Insinuating that they're not American or those type of things. So So thank you both. I'm going to move on to our next question, if that's all right. So in our last episode of the podcast, we talked a lot about systemic changes needing to happen. So when we talk about systemic changes, when we hear talk about that, what does that look like to both of you? What does systemic change look like?
When I think about systemic changes, I automatically see the police force. Like I see the entire thing needing to be redone. Honestly, everything in society, the laws and everything should be redone. I don't understand why we're still using things. We're still using laws. We're still using branches of government. We're still using things that were never meant for a diverse group for all of us. And it just needs to be revamped. It needs to be recreated or destroyed and started all over again, because what we're dealing with now is just, it's not going to get any better if it continues down this path.
Yeah, and I'd say for me, Jeremiah, when I hear systematic changes, I think of it in three ways. Javonie mentioned one is the police brutality and just issues regarding our police forces around the nation. So that's one. Second would be criminal justice reform. So all the way to the prosecutor's office. I mean, the attorney general, we all see what's going on in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, with the attorney general still hasn't arrested the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. So that's an example of systematic changes that we needed within the criminal justice system. And then thirdly would be reparations. Those are the three things that I believe, and that when I hear systematic changes, that's what it's going to take. And when I say reparations, a lot of people kind of cringe or, get up in arms about that topic, especially right now within the presidential election. But if you think about it, reparations isn't hard. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the other minority groups that we have here present in America, Black people are the only people who have yet to be allocated or paid out reparations. Now, reparations can mean a lot of things. A lot of people cringe at it or, frown at it because they think it's a monetary payment, or, they just, well, why are we paying Black people money? But think about it. Last time I checked, the Jewish community got reparations, and they're not from America historically. So that's one example. I think about the Native American community. And when I think about reservations and land that they've received, not, in justifiable amounts, but at the same time, to the principle, they've received reparations. And out of both of those, minority ethnic groups, or, I want to be careful how I address the Jewish community, but, religious groups as well, too. Black people are the only and the last. Everybody gets paid except us. So that could be in land, that can be in terms of tax relief, that can be in terms of home ownership, that can be in terms of job equity. We already even talked about on the podcast disparities in a lot of professions like doctors, lawyers, pilots. Reparations can come in a lot of different forms. But that's what I think about when I think of systematic changes. Those have to happen, or else, like Javonie mentioned, earlier in the podcast, we're just labeling things Black Lives Matter. We're putting it on the course. It's just symbolism. Now, I do want to say we appreciate the symbolism, but I don't want to make it a religious thing. But faith without works is dead. So just saying something and thinking it cures it. It doesn't. So that's what it has to take for systematic changes for me. Criminal justice reform, police brutality has to be addressed, and then we have to at least get to a point where we can feel comfortable about talking openly and freely about reparations.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Jamaal. Since we're nearing the end of our time, I always like to leave at the end having a discussion about what type of advice and takeaways could you leave our listeners? So I guess I have two questions about that. The first one is that, so many people are working to bring awareness and change to anti-racist, equity, inclusion issues for so many years. And a lot of people feel like they have the way figured out. So this is the way we should do it. And both of you, in your opinions, what are some advice or suggestions or observations do you have about the way the movement has been handled in the past, and the way the work's being done now? So what are some advice, suggestions, observations you have about, I guess, the way the work is being carried out by people nowadays?
Jamaal, would you like to start?
That's a good one. Jeremiah, let me start with the first part of that. What advice, suggestions? My advice and my plea would just be, first off, to educate ourselves. I know we have a lot of competing priorities. I know it's life. We got to work. We got kids. COVID is still happening. We got the election coming up. We got wildfires on the West Coast. We got weird dust storms coming from Africa. We got climate change. It's 8 million things at us right now. But if I could just make one suggestion and one plea, it's just to educate ourselves on the whole Black Lives Matter movement. And when I say ourselves, I mean African Americans as well, because I don't want to put, it is more, I feel like it's more important, and it's more white Americans who need the education and awareness. But to the same point, I've also been having conversations with some of my peers who are African American, and some points or some topics, they're not as educated as well either to what's going on, whether it's propaganda, whether it's historical context of situations, whether it's previous events that have happened in the recent or older U.S. history. It's just the education. Education. I mean, that's why, Javonie, that's why you're in school right now. That's why I went to school, to get a decent job, to make a good living. It all starts with education. So that would be my plea and suggestion, is for people to educate themselves before jumping on either side of a debate. And the observation about the way the movement has been handled, in the past and what's being done now is, I feel like now two things. One, it's more white Americans. This is the most, and I was talking to my mom. I was like, Mom, was it this many white people, at the protest and, marching with? She was like, Jamaal, I have never seen anything like, as far as from a numbers perspective. So I feel like it's a lot of younger people. It's a lot of people who are tired of, who are the children of some older Americans who are like, look, you've been telling us this lie for this long, and you sent us to school to get an education. We're smart enough to know this isn't the truth anymore. So younger adults and white allies are stepping up and saying, hey, this is enough of this BS. We're not even accepting the lie anymore, because it was a point where, we'll just sweep it under the rug historically in the past. So we'll see you struggling, and we may help you out, behind the scenes. But we're not going to be on the front lines with you marching. We're not going to be on the front lines with you protesting. We're not going to be, picking it and making signs with you and, standing outside a city hall. So I really think that's what's different now compared to the past, is the involvement of the youth and the involvement of more white allies. And another thing that I've seen the difference between now and historically is organizations are stepping up. So before it would be, pockets of Americans, or maybe a few, for me, I don't know about Javonie, like I had a couple of what I used to call like some good white neighbors who would look out and who would, give me some game, give me some perspective. They would tell me some things to watch out for. They would, have conversations with me to let me know they have their struggle, but they would never, like I said, say it again in public or around their other white friends. So I think the speaking up and involvement of larger organizations like companies. I mean, we got Black Lives Matter commercials now. I mean, I'm sure that wasn't going on back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So I think more organizations, whether it's corporate, nonprofit, philanthropic, more organizations and less individuals are stepping up to put their foot down as well. So that's the difference that I see.
Thank you, Javonie.
That was so well said, Jamaal. Honestly, it really was so well said. Honestly, I feel the biggest advice that I can give allies is practice empathy. Severely practice empathy. I practice empathy every day, and that allows me to want to be a better person. That allows me to want to do better, for people that not only don't look like me, but we have issues that we could get resolved for them. It's also not diminishing the voice of Black Lives Matter or Black individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Black Lives Matter always has to get devalued to all-inclusive events rather than it just being about Black people. And I've said this numerous times, and unfortunately, it's still doing that. And I just want more allies to, unfortunately, we do have to educate, even though it's not our job to necessarily educate on something that you can easily access. But we do have to educate, and we do have to be basically the advocate of Black Lives Matter. We have to show people that there is a fine line between propaganda and what is actually happening. And a lot of Americans want to look for reasons to not support the movement. They want to look for reasons to do it. So it's really not letting a general consensus of everybody not wanting to support the movement get you down, because the harder we go, the more that we support this movement, the better things will get in the future. You know, we've been doing this forever, an eternity now. It seems like our parents were doing this, their parents were doing this, but you know, we can't stop fighting, because that's what we have in the end. If we're not fighting, what are we doing? We're giving up, and that's not what we're going to do.
No, that's amazing. I think, Javonie, you hit it on the nail with the empathy. It reminds me of a post, and you know, to what you said towards the, you know, one movement doesn't have to diminish somebody else's. And I was trying to look real quick on my phone because I know time's winding up here. Just posted out bookmarked on Instagram, but I'm gonna have to paraphrase it. But I think it'll still have the same impact. On 9/11, you never hear anybody say all lives matter. So we just passed, you know, September 11th, and we all remember that tragedy and how many Americans it killed. But, you know, 9/11, it's always never forget, remember, but it's never all buildings matter. You know, when everybody says, you know, it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month in October, they have their own month. I mean, you can buy pink ribbon clothing, ties, shoes, cars. I mean, just about anything with a breast cancer ribbon on it. During October, nobody says, you know, what about colon cancer? What about prostate cancer? What about lung cancer? And you think about what's another situation that I saw in this post? I can't remember the third one, but at the end of the post it said, why is Black Lives Matter the only movement or the only occasion where we like to diminish one and mention all the others? We never do that with any of those other situations. So practicing empathy, that one hit home for me, Javonie, and that post came up to mind when you just said that. So I just wanted to share that as well.
Awesome, thank you. And you know, Javonie, you already kind of answered my last question I was going to ask about if you guys have any advice for allies, because a lot of allies are listening to this podcast and wanting to educate themselves more and to be better allies. And I think that the Visibility Podcast is not just going to be about race relations; it's going to be about other marginalized groups as well. So, for allies, regardless of whatever topic, what are some areas that they can improve upon? And I know, Javonie, you've already touched on that by having those voices of Black Lives Matter be African-American voices first and foremost. But is there anything else that you'd like for allies to know and then maybe improve on? Suggestions for allies?
To never stop learning, like to never stop wanting to gain more knowledge on a situation. Sometimes it can feel like you're not doing anything right, but it takes strength to hear that, okay, I did something wrong. This is how I do better. To be criticized, to take constructive criticism. Majority of Americans cannot take it at all. So you're already in the better boat if you can take constructive criticism. And it's going to happen a lot. You're going to make mistakes, but just know we're going to have to learn and grow with the help of one another in order to make things better.
Well said, Javonie. And so I think that's a great way to end it. So thank you both so much for being here today. I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and on how your generation is tackling these issues. So thank you, Javonie. Thank you, Jamaal.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me, Jeremiah. I appreciated the discussion.
You can stay connected with the Visibility Project by subscribing, liking, and sharing on your favorite podcasting and social apps. Look for us at the Visibility PRJ.
Financial support is needed to keep the conversation going. Go to midlandfoundation.org/give and select the Cultural Awareness Coalition Endowment Fund to be part of the project. Note podcast in your donation notes.
Thank you for listening.
We see you.
We hear you.
And together, we are making a difference.